Given that artificial intelligence is such a prevalent topic in today's society, I think now is a pretty good time to be looking back at those old science fiction stories of generations past to see if those ideas can be contextualised for the modern world. And Doctor Who, in and of itself, had no shortage of artificial intelligence themes within its own adventures, from the mad computer buffoonery in stories such as The Green Death, to the strange alien technologies fused with the imaginations of humans to create strange and wonderful lands in stories such as The Mind Robber, and that is just two examples. Today I will be landing smack bang in the middle of the Philip Hinchcliffe era, an era of Doctor Who which had no hang-ups on paying homage to certain tropes in literature, TV and film, and this particular story mashed up lots of different ideas to create, well, a mashup of lots of different ideas. I am of course talking about 1977's The Robots of Death. But does The Robots' Death speak to us now in this day and age, or is it just a bit of fun? Let's find out. And thank you very much to the Nap Taker for requesting this story over on Patreon. For just £1 a month you can become a distinguished follower and request your Doctor Who topic for coverage. Your name will be mentioned in the video and your contribution will go towards making this channel a bigger, stronger, smarter, better smelling and more intelligent place in its own right. Big thanks to everybody who has signed up so far, and another special thanks to the Nap Taker for requesting this adventure. Let's go. So, from the outset of Robots of Death, it's pretty obvious where this story gets its main source of inspiration from, at least aesthetically. You've got the planet full of sand, you've got the big industrial mining machine crawling its way across that sandy landscape. It is, of course, very much like Frank Herbert's Dune. So, the crew are humans, and they are kind of living a bit of a life of decadence. They're wearing nice silky robes, they're lying and sitting on comfy looking chairs, they are playing games, drinking interesting looking beverages and having massages. And all of this is at the behest of a particular brand of robot. This type of robot exists only for the benefit of human beings. They live in full servitude. Whilst they are sentient in their own right, their only real purpose is to be quiet and do as they are told and follow orders. You've got one engaging in a game of chess, which is actually better than his human opponent at.
The computation is confirmed.
Damn! You've got one giving a person a massage while that person is being told that a robot went mad and twisted a bloke's arm off a while back. They are generally just waiting hand and foot on their human bosses, and they are even driving the vehicle while these guys kick back and have a bit of a laugh. But everything changes soon enough because there is a sandstorm coming, and sandstorms on this particular world contain a plethora of minerals and other resources that when extracted can warrant a big payday for the crew. So it's action stations at the ready, and when they get dressed into their work uniform, they look pretty ridiculous, to be fair. One of the main supporting characters, Yuvanov, looks kind of like a mockbuster Ming the Merciless. And that is where my criticism of the cosmetics of this particular story ends, because everything else visually is just... As I have said probably about 1,000,000 times on this channel before, I simply cannot get along with this idea that the old special effects in classic Doctor Who were cheap and rubbish. That does not look cheap and rubbish to me. This is maximum effort here. You've got the model, you've got the landscape of the entire planet, and, you know, it's mainly comprised of rocks, but you've even got this little effect where they have smaller rocks and pebbles rolling down the big rocks to evoke the idea that this is a constantly harsh and moving landscape. You've got the classic Tom Baker red and green lighting to give that slightly brooding gothic science fiction feel to it. The model of itself is superb, kind of looks like a robotic sphinx holding a mobile phone in its mouth, but that's all good. And the camera angle position is underneath, so this entire thing dominates the scene whenever it appears, and this whole thing comes together to create something that is more than the sum of its parts, something that is passionately put together. And yes, obviously it's a miniature, but it still looks brilliant. Okay, this model has moving parts, it's got cutters and spinny bits and propellers, and later on in the story you get like a dust storm which blows in with lots of sand, and it kind of reminds me of the South Pole thing that I talked about in the 10th Planet video, when it was in a studio and they blew what was probably an unhealthy amount of polystyrene into the atmosphere, and it just looked really effective, really harsh, probably not massively safe to do so. But all those things considered, all those things put together, this isn't just one thing they did, it's lots of things that they put together to create this overall impression, and it looks and feels brilliant. A little bit later on in this adventure, the Doctor and Leela land in one of the deposit sections of the sand miner when all the sand comes in, and they look for a vent into the outside world. And this is one of the things that I've talked about as well before, is that I love classic Doctor Who sets where you have small interiors that look out into big spaces. I think that's so effective and so important, and they do that here. They're looking out onto the landscape. Leela says it's beautiful, and you really get the impression that you are living within this vast barren world. Despite the fact this entire story is set within the confines of this sand miner, you really feel like you are in a big place. Excellent stuff. And the same amount of credit goes to the party pieces of the story themselves, the robots. Even if you've dipped your toes in Doctor Who at some point in your life, there's no doubt that you've probably seen this design somewhere in some magazine or on a video package or something, or anywhere. And there's a good reason why it has stood the test of time as far as I'm concerned. I mean, yes, there is a faint sort of 70s production value to it. When you look at it closely, you can see the seams and the paintwork, but the actual cosmetic of this thing is, I can't give enough credit for how clever it is, okay? And the reason why I think it's clever is because it is a face for any occasions. Depending on the shot, depending on the mood, depending on the atmosphere and the part of the story, this thing can go from looking really bubbly and innocent and likeable to something altogether scary and nightmarish. And a lot of that is to do with the eyes. The eyes actually change frequently. Sometimes you get moments where those eyes are just completely black, and other times they shine up in this kind of red crimson static effect, which you saw in pretty much every Tom Baker story in existence. So that goes some way to differentiating the not scary elements of this robot to the very scary elements of this robot, but also just its face in general. Now, what I find interesting the most about this is that later on in the story, and we'll get to that in due course, they put forward this idea of something called robophobia. Now, on the surface, robophobia sounds like just a generic term for having a xenophobic attitude towards robots, which might be a thing in the deep future. Hopefully not, but you know, human beings. But it's actually more of an uncanny valley thing. It's this idea that because the robot kind of looks human but is not, there is something about the human brain that gets an extreme level of worry and anxiety and paranoia when in the presence of one of these things, due to the fact that it doesn't have any real kind of facial expressions, it doesn't have any mannerisms, it doesn't really move or act like a human, it just passes off as a human barely through facial features. It creates this effect known widely in today's world as uncanny valley, when something looks human but it's not, and that is creepy. I probably haven't explained that in the greatest amount of detail. If you've never heard that term before, check it out on the internet, it is very interesting, and these robots captivate it in a way that I don't think many other Doctor Who creatures do. Like many Doctor Who creatures in the classic era were meant to be either kind of scary or extremely passive, and this, it kind of sort of teeters between the two. It's a very clever design. So the Doctor is chit-chatting in the TARDIS with his newly acquired companion Leela. This is only her second adventure. She's still got that gun from the Face of Evil. And again, can I please give a special shout out to the short-lived gothic interior of the TARDIS. I mean, the control console does look a little bit small and just generally inadequate, but I love the fact there was a period when the inside of the TARDIS looked like this. You know, even the monitor looks cool. It's just a good design, and it fits the piece and the mood and the tempo of Doctor Who as it was in that current era. Being a tribal warrior, Leela is struggling to wrap her head around the finer points of the concept of time and relative dimensions in space, which is why the Doctor conjures up this brilliant demonstration of how the TARDIS works. I remember seeing this clip in the 1992 documentary Resistance is Useless, and I just thought as a child it was an excellent way of explaining how the probably scientifically impossible concept of the TARDIS actually works. He takes two boxes, one larger than the other, and moves the larger one to the opposite side of the room so it looks perception-wise smaller, and then he explains if it was over there and here at the same time it would fit inside the smaller box, and that is how the TARDIS works. Genius. All the explanation you need, and that was several decades before David Tennant ever did his timey-wimey. And coincidentally enough, when they land in the sand miner, there just so happens to be a murder. What's his name? Grub? His name's Chud. I'll go again. And it just so happens that when the TARDIS land in the sand miner, one of the crew members, Chud, is murdered. He is strangled, apparently, which makes no sense because you can also hear him scream. Interesting. So when somebody is murdered on this sand miner, the killer leaves a small circular red object on their body called a corpse marker. A corpse marker is kind of a slang term for a marking device placed on the robots so the factory knows that those particular robots are in deactivation mode. It's kind of like a weird creepy trophy that is put on the bodies by whoever's doing this as some kind of ironic gesture, symbolism type thing. Anyway, the Doctor and Leela land, and straight away they are the perfect scapegoats. No psychic paper to be found, so they spend the beginning of this story locked up in a cell, guarded by robots, while the crew immediately start infighting with each other. A couple of the crew members, such as Poole and Toos, are campaigning for this operation to be put on hiatus while they find out who is doing all the killing, but then you've got Ivanov, who is heading the operation, who just wants to carry on because the only thing he appears to be interested in is money, that big fat payday which they will only get if they just carry on working, even if it is at the expense of people dying. So the Doctor and Leela are placed in prison for a lot of the opening of this story, and even within the Doctor and Leela's own understanding of robots, there is that little bit of intolerance towards this community of cybernetic people. Like, Leela calls them creepy mechanical men, and the Doctor really emphasises a lot through this story how the robots don't have any feelings and how it's the people who are programming those robots that we need to be worried about. Anyway, they escape from the cell with ease and decide to go exploring, at which point the Doctor finds another body inside one of the chambers where all the extracted sand goes, and guess what? It starts to extract sand, so the room fills up with big lumpy sediment and the Doctor supposedly drowns, except he doesn't drown because he's got a snorkel. Standard. So with this murder mystery element giving the story its wings, we've kind of gone from Frank Herbert to Isaac Asimov to Agatha Christie. Interesting mix. And speaking of Isaac Asimov, these robots of course obey the first law of robotics, originally devised by Isaac Asimov in works such as I, Robot and before. Now, the first law of robotics is, of course, that a robotic cannot harm or kill a human being. This isn't the only story to utilise that idea, and it certainly is not the last. In this particular story, there is absolutely no possibility whatsoever of these robots being the killers. Nope, couldn't happen. Done. Just forget about that. Just drop that line of inquiry. There's no way that... Okay, so there are three different types of robots. There are the Vox, which are the standard green ones. There is the Super Vox, which is the one solo silver controller. And you've got the Dumbs. And the dumbs are basically not supposed to speak. I can't help thinking in this day and age they'd have thought of a better word for it than that. But in this case, they cannot speak, they are completely mute, except, of course, for D84, who can speak. And he has infiltrated a cell just when Leela finds a third body. And the D-robot restrains Leela and puts his hand on her mouth and then reassures her that he's not actually here to kill her.
If I had killed him, would I not have killed you too?
Yeah, great. She must feel really comforted at that. Thanks. So the deal with D84 is that he is on a mission of his own, and apparently he is not part of the same line of controlling as all the other robots who appear to be run by their controller SV7, aka Supervox 7. And this is where some more interesting layers to the story come in, and as to whether or not they work, well, meh. So at this point in time, the Doctor's biggest aid in getting to the bottom of this mystery is Poole, a guy that seems like one of the good ones. For now. Poole. It is there that the Doctor proposes the idea that the only thing that could have strangled the man or killed him in any other fashion in that room originally would have been one of the robots, an idea that Poole does not like at all. Likewise, Uvanov appears to be the biggest dick on the sandmine, refuting any idea that anybody other than Doctor and Leela did the murders when obviously they didn't, but luckily both the Doctor and Leela are giving him lots and lots of backchat. I hate this bit when he smacks Leela in the face, but I love the bit after when she boots his sorry ass across the room. Makes his redemption arc later on a little bit hard to swallow, but here we are in this moment in time, and nobody's taken him seriously, so he starts to have a bit of a sulk, and that is when a new twist and a new dimension comes into this story. One of the characters, Zilda, who has been at odds with Uvanov this entire time, sneaks into his quarters and discovers that her brother was killed on one of Uvanov's expeditions, and Uvanov stood there and did nothing, apparently. Next time you see her, she's dead. Another massively shifty scene that you see in the second episode of this story is a human hand passing a corpse marker into a robot's hand. Here is a character, Dask, who I forgot to mention. He's just being Dask. Nothing to see here. At the end of episode 2, the Sandminer gets sabotaged. Everything's going to blow up until he helps to quell the sabotage by causing a big explosion, and then the whole bloody thing starts to sink into the ground. Anyway, on a topic completely unrelated to Dask and his very sinister looking face, it is apparent at this point that if the robots are the ones doing the killing, they also have a human accomplice. I wonder who it can be. Episode 3 is kind of when the narrative starts to derail a little bit, as far as I'm concerned. Everything operates in a kind of linear fashion up until this point, but when you get to episode 3, it all starts to just get a little bit jumbled and a little bit confusing from my perspective. I don't think it's unusual for the Doctor to be one step ahead of the audience when it comes to figuring out mysteries and things. That is usually the case, and if the Doctor is holding something back, it is to the benefit of the revelation when it does happen, because it's that much more impactful to the audience. But this time around, I think he's just not telling the audience, like he assumes that the audience already knows what he does. That's just the impression that the writing gives me. He has a conversation with D84, the robot who isn't supposed to talk, and it's like the audience are supposed to be up to speed with what they're talking about, but we're not really. He is instantly able to deduce that D84 is here on a secret mission of his own volition, and he has an accomplice of his own as well. And this is when you get this entire new narrative that pretty much jumps in out of nowhere, where they talk about these threatening letters that have been sent off to the company in charge of this mining expedition. The person behind the letters is a one Mr. Taran Capel, a scientist and robot fanatic who was born and raised among robots and wants to ignite a robot revolution and have a kind of rising of the downtrodden moment with the robot community so they can overthrow humanity and basically take over the galaxy or something. This entire explanation goes very fast indeed, and it's pretty difficult to keep up unless you've watched this episode a number of times. But there you go. So it's all about this Taran Capel fella from now on, who the Doctor instantly dismisses has any kind of clear moral motive and immediately immediately decides that he's a bad guy. And that is true to a degree, but you can't help trying to see things from the robot side as well. And this is where the messages and the narrative all gets a little bit muddled. Anyway, it's reasonable for the audience to assume that Taron Capel is pulling the strings on these murders, and he might even be on the sand miner somewhere. An idea that D84 refutes altogether because D84 checked the logs of all the crew members before going on this expedition.
I know what they look like.
Before they came on board?
I had overlooked the possibility of substitution.
Yes, you had.
That's really bad. So you get to a scene where you actually see one of the robots being reprogrammed for killing, basically. The Isaac Asimov rule of robotics has been completely overridden, and they can now kill within an inch of their synthetic lives. And you see a glimpse of the mysterious figure who is reprogramming these robots. You see a very cleverly disguised impression of certain elements of this mysterious figure's features on a monitor, and it's Dask. It's clearly Dask. It's obviously him. That's flipping rubbish. You can tell because it's his face, and they really did nothing to cover it up. And in the next scene where he's in the room, he puts a cloth on his head as though to disguise who it is to the audience, even though, yeah, it's Dask. He's Taron Capel. This story has a big problem delivering information correctly. That is one of the biggest flaws in the Robots of Death. The things that you aren't supposed to know are made extremely obvious. Even when Chubb, the first victim, gets murdered, it's obviously a robot doing it because you see the robot walking towards him with the big red eyes. That's the lid has just been blown off that from the word go. And this whole who is Dask thing, there it is, and it's supposed to be some kind of mystery. Meanwhile, you get the actual complex nuances of the story, which are so coded and so hidden that you can be forgiven for them going completely over your head. It's just, yeah. The writing on this is strange, but mechanically I do like how this is done. When the robot's reprogrammed, he has a bit of a glitch moment.
Orders accepted. Orders accepted.
And then Taron Capel says, "Go, brother, you are one of us now." Fanatical he is. Okay, so let's have some fun with some killer robots on the rampage. We are at that portion of the story. Here we go. Each one gets handed a token, one of them gets handed two because he's greedy, and they are assigned to kill various crew members. Leela has a bit of a struggle with a robot that's been assigned to kill her. Good heavens. But she manages to escape, and meanwhile another robot has been assigned to strangle Toos, but then gets recalled at the last minute, so he kind of fails in his mission as well. And look who's back. It's Uvanov. Turns out he was a pretty nice dude after all, even though being a massive swine, idiot, controlling buffoon in the first half of the story. He's changed his tune a little bit now, and you realise that whole thing of the death of Zilda's brother was actually a bit of a misunderstanding. He tried to save the kid, but the company covered it up to make him look like the bad guy, and that probably feeds into some of the reasoning why he's such a cold-hearted fool at the beginning of this story. I still like it that Leela kicks him though. But here we are, and he's here to save the Doctor. By contrast, Poole, who everyone thought was going to be the main supporting protagonist, has turned out to be a completely useless waste of space. He has extreme robophobia, which is not his fault, I guess, but he doesn't handle this problem with any level of dignity. He is perfectly happy to sell anyone out just to get himself out of a dangerous situation, and he ends up just running around screaming like a big flipping goon for the rest of the story. It actually seems like the writers couldn't even be asked of him anymore, so he just disappears and never comes back. They don't even mention him at the end. Done. And also, Poole was D84's right-hand man. They were both sent by the company together to uncover any operations performed by Taron Capel. So yeah, that was a loose end that kind of goes nowhere, and that brings us roundabout to the final act of this story, whereby Dask, aka Taron Capel, has gone full robot. He's got the face paint, he's got his armies with him, and he is all about those robot vibes, leading his troops around to do all all the killing, to completely wipe out any resistance, and then proceed to his next mission of overthrowing the human race. He's got it all figured out. The Doctor is very dismissive of his plans. He just thinks he's another tyrant and another buffoon megalomaniac who wants power. So we get lots of robot fights and explosions, and D-84 does the ultimate sacrifice and blows himself up to blow up another load of robots so that the Doctor can make his final move. Dask, aka Taron Capel, despite his intelligence and tyranny, is about to meet what is probably not a particularly dignified end to supposedly evil henchman. Leela hides inside a closet and releases a helium tank, which causes Taron's voice to go all squeaky, so the robots no longer recognize his commands and kill him as they would any other human. Oops. This is another point where it all feels kind of rushed and jumbled at the end. There's a bit of a scuffle between Toos and a robot, and the Doctor manages to pull them apart, and you just hear this Tom Baker dubbing saying, "You'll be okay, Toos," just to explain to the audience that she's okay. And then the final robot gets stabbed in the head and they all get shut down, and the Doctor says this.
Well, all good things come to an end.
I'm sorry, Doctor, I love you, but I have no idea why you just said that. So, can the robots of death be contextualized for the modern world? Are there any artificial intelligence related themes in this story that can be attributed to what is happening right now? Well, I find, for one, the Uncanny Valley thing still a rather fascinating avenue of exploration. This idea of something that looks human but isn't, so it triggers this kind of instinctive response in the brain to not trust or be wary or be fearful. And it might have been better if they found some way to explore the idea of reconciliation, how humans can explore this own instinct within their own minds to create a more tolerant, more level-headed response to this new breed of life form, which is essentially not doing anything wrong until it has been programmed to do so. And I suppose this kind of feeds into a theme of intolerance and phobia, which operates on a sort of blood relative level to the idea of these robots being underlings and slaves and not being considered a sentient life form of any true worth other than complete servitude. Like, it's interesting throughout this story that the human crew members are constantly making slurs and derogatory comments to these robots, and these robots don't do anything really kind of rebellious in response to that. There is no real act of defiance past being reprogrammed by another human themselves. So there is something you can look into there, and it's a little bit heartbreaking that the Doctor and Leela feed into this form of intolerance themselves. The Doctor doesn't really rise above it at any point. Now, it's perfectly within your own discretion whether or not you want to completely ignore the politics in this story and just enjoy the robot killings and the visuals. Cool. But seeing as this draws from themes of sentient life being controlled by other life, I think it does warrant a kind of conversation on how this reflection of reality can be portrayed in science fiction story. It warrants it because it talks about it, but it doesn't quite see it through. These robots are slaves. They are life forms that have been enslaved, and that is a reflection of the real world, and where certain races of humanity have been enslaved by other richer, more powerful races of humanity. And I'm not sure that it sees this through to the end. It kind of establishes that concept and then kind of sidelines it in terms, it kind of sidelines it in favour of the usual generic tropes of he's bad, robots bad, they must all be killed. And there's no real kind of closure and no real moral messaging at the end of this story. It just ends with the Doctor saying all good things must come to an end, which means absolutely nothing. So I suppose that does kind of combine with the Uncanny Valley idea to a degree, but when you mix up those things, it does sort of become less than the sum of it its parts. It introduces an interesting concept which was introduced previously in Isaac Asimov's stories in the 1960s and the likes, but it doesn't really follow it through to its natural conclusion. However, when you put that to one side, I don't want to dunk on this story too hard. The general spectacle of this story is something that stands the test of time for a good reason. So I am giving the Robots of Death a tentative approval from the Chosen Chimp. It's just one of those examples that when they bring in something meaningful and political into the story, they really should do a bit of a better job of maintaining that to the end. I consider Robots of Death to be a fun, enjoyable spectacle with a bit of a troubled undercurrent. Disagree with me? Power to you. Get yourself in the comments and tell me what you thought of the Robots of Death, and thank you so much for watching this video. If you want to check me out on social media, then please visit my Blue Sky page at thechosenchimp.bsky.social. I hope you are all safe and well, and please, for the love of Pete and his world, have a good one.